Last night, the majority leader of the Senate came to the floor, and on the continuing resolution, which is essentially the only bill that we will consider this year of the funding of our government, it's over $1 trillion in taxpayer money, came to the floor and brought forward a unanimous consent agreement that only contained a handful of amendments that could be brought to the continuing resolution, and many amendments that were germane and, in my view, reasonable, had been brought to the attention of both sides well in advance, were denied an opportunity for a vote on the floor. Because of that, I objected to the consideration of the continuing resolution, the unanimous consent agreement, because frankly, I think when we're spending over $1 trillion in the only funding bill we're going to vote on, really essentially this year, appropriations bill, that we should be allowed to have votes on amendments, particularly amendments as many of my colleagues have had, and my own amendment, which is one that would strike funding for essentially a missile to nowhere, that we will never get a program or a missile program or a product that our military will ever be able to use. And so my amendment was very straightforward. The amendment would strike funding for the Medium Extended Air Defense System program, called the MEADS program, by $381 million. These funds were appropriated for this program, and would actually transfer the funds to the operations and maintenance portion of the defense budget, so that the money could be used for our men and women in uniform for things that they actually need, as opposed to $380 million for a missile to nowhere that we will never get a result for. You know, when we are almost $17 trillion in debt, it's truly shocking that we would continue to spend money on a program that the Army says it does not want. In fact, the defense authorization last year, the Armed Services Committee actually prohibited funding for the MEADS program. This is something that was passed unanimously on a bipartisan basis last year in the defense authorization bill that prohibited any further funding for this missile to nowhere. And yet it got included in the appropriations in this continuing resolution, despite the fact that we are not going to get anything our warfighters can use from $380 million of spending. In fact, when Secretary Hagel was asked about whether the Pentagon would comply with this law, he said yes. Let's just review where we are with this program. The Army has already invested over $2 billion for this program, and we're not going to get a result. It was underperforming. So according to John McCain, the Secretary of the Army, in 2011, he said, the Army has invested over $2 billion, and that's only partial cost of the program, and frankly, it was underperforming. Again, what else has been said? Frank Kendall, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Technology, says, MEADS is a program that the U.S. decided not to procure a year ago. So why, when our country is facing sequestration, when our men and women in uniform need to make sure that the defense dollars that we are providing them are actually resources that they can use for their needs to protect them, to protect our country, are we spending $380 million on something that we will not procure, we will not get a result for? To me, this is outrageous. And if we can't cut spending for this, how are we ever going to deal with the underlying drivers of our debt, with our nearly $17 trillion in debt? In fact, the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, this is what he has said. I have great respect for Chairman Levin, and he has said about the MEADS program, we feel strongly that it is a waste of money. And so I stood up on the floor last night because I have bipartisan support for this amendment. This is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. This is about making sure that we don't waste money at a time when our warfighters need the money for the support, the training, at the time that they're facing sequestration, that we're facing real threats to our country, and we cannot afford to spend more money on a missile to nowhere. And so I'm very proud that I have bipartisan support from Senator Begich, Senator Shaheen, yet it's shocking to me that I cannot get a vote. It's germane that we cannot strike this funding or get a vote on this Senate floor to strike this funding from this continuing resolution and to make sure that the funds actually go to the operations and maintenance portion of the defense budget so that they can use this money, our warfighters can use it for needs that they actually have. I also want to mention that the Council for the Citizens Against Government Waste supports my amendment. The Concerned Veterans for America, the CEO of the Concerned Veterans for America has said, MEADS is the quintessential Pentagon program that lives on indefinitely, despite the fact that it will never see the field of battle. With our nation drowning in $16.7 trillion worth of debt, Congress must undertake serious reforms to defense spending to maintain a sustainable fiscal path that preserves American power. And the Concerned Veterans of America has supported this amendment. And basically, this is common sense. And this is the kind of thing that people see at home and say, how could you possibly spend $380 million on a missile to nowhere when we know that our men and women in uniform can use those funds for equipment that they can use in theater, for training that they can use to be prepared? And it's really unconscionable that we will not allow a vote on the continuing resolution for something that has bipartisan support, for something that was actually struck by the Authorization Committee on both sides of the aisle, both in the House Armed Services Committee and in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And when the Majority Leader took to the floor last night, he said, oh, we've made reasonable accommodations. I don't see what's reasonable about giving a handful of amendments with over $1 trillion of spending. You know, on Wednesday, Senator McCain brought forth an amendment, and the amendment was last Wednesday, so almost a week ago. He brought forth an amendment to strike other unauthorized funds from the continuing resolution and to leave those funds for the military to use for priority items and for things that our men and women in uniform actually needed. And you know what happened? There was a motion to table brought against Senator McCain's amendment. And essentially what he was trying to do is what I'm trying to do today, to stop money that's not been authorized, to stop spending money when our men and women in uniform need us to allow them to use these resources for the basic needs that they have. And that's why he brought this amendment to the floor. And you know what happened? There was a motion to table filed against his amendment. And I think there was a real shock on the floor from both sides of the aisle, because on a bipartisan basis, that motion to table failed because both sides of the aisle realized that when we're facing sequestration, when we are facing a dangerous world, when we owe it to our men and women in uniform, we cannot continue to fund things that aren't priorities. We can't continue to fund missiles to nowhere. And that amendment was eventually adopted by a voice vote. This amendment is just like that amendment. The American people are tired of us not allowing common sense amendments to come to the floor for a vote. I mean, is it with $1 trillion in spending, if we had started voting on amendments last Wednesday after the floor was shut down, and I think there was a shock among leadership that Senator McCain won his amendment on a bipartisan basis and was able to overturn the motion to table his amendment. If we had started voting on amendments then, we would have already passed the continuing resolution. So it is an absolute cop-out to say that we're somehow faced with a government shutdown, that somehow we can't have votes on the Senate floor on amendments that are important, germane, and relevant. And before I leave it, I want to support my colleague, Jerry Moran, because he was also denied an amendment that's an important amendment. I'm a co-sponsor of that amendment. The FAA has notified 189 towers across the country that it is going to cease to fund the towers operation because of sequester. And Senator Moran has a common sense amendment that would make sure that it restores 95% of this funding by taking money from other areas in the FAA budget that will not disrupt operations. Well, there is a tower in Nashua, New Hampshire, in Bois Field, that was on the list of the FAA, despite the airport's importance to both the United States and New England, and despite a recent investment of over $24 million by the FAA to upgrade the airport's runway. And Senator Moran's amendment, which he is also being denied an ability to bring on this floor to have both sides vote on, he has strong bipartisan support. This amendment would ensure that towers like the tower at Bois Field in Nashua, New Hampshire, my hometown, continue to operate, yet we will not be given a vote on this Senate floor despite the strong bipartisan support that Senator Moran has for his amendment, just like I have bipartisan support for my amendment. So I have to ask, what's the problem? Why can't we just vote on the amendments? Start voting, keep voting, get it done. We can pass the continuing resolution. We can continue to fund this government, but you know what? We can make improvements to the continuing resolution by striking money for the missile to nowhere, by making sure that the air towers that the FAA is shutting down continue to operate in this country. And I'm sure that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have many more ideas as to how we can improve this continuing resolution. But the American people will never know about those ideas because we're on a Senate floor where we are not being allowed to vote on the amendments that matter to the American people, that strike wasteful spending, that improve this important piece of legislation. And I think if we had started voting last Wednesday, we would have already allowed every person in this chamber to have a vote on their amendment. As the Senate was intended to operate, this is intended to be the most deliberative body in the world. Yet if you can't bring an amendment that is germane to strike spending for a missile to nowhere, it really renders the operation of the United States Senate at this point not what the founding fathers intended. It really it puts a gag on the American people that their elected representatives can't come here and get votes on things that are going to strike funding like this, that are going to make sure that air towers continue to operate in this country. And Mr. President, I think we owe it to the American people that their elected representatives can come down here and get a vote on amendments that matter, that make a difference, that can improve this continuing resolution. And frankly, this notion that we can't have votes on it, obviously people don't want to have votes on it. They want to continue funding missiles to nowhere, whether it's their parochial interests or whatever interests that are driving them here. It's wrong. We have to stop it. Bring this amendment to the Senate floor. Let's vote it up or down now, and let's move forward. I thank you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to speak today, and I yield the floor.